Hello, and welcome to Day 2 of the 2021 SDG Action Zone. I'm Nadira Hira, your MC, coming to you from our COVID-safe New York City studio. Today, we're focusing on gender equality, inclusivity, and acceptance for all as the game changer we need, a true prerequisite for a better world. But exactly what that means, what it looks and feels like, what it demands, can be difficult to articulate. We're going to give it our very best shot though, starting with this next performance, a spoken word piece by young, powerful Nigerian-American poet, Sore Agbaje. Take it away, Sore.
My father fears the night's wide mouth, says this is no time for a girl. Each footstep closer to home is an answered prayer. I fear I am a night away from turning him unbeliever. Us girls just want to stay alive. At each curve we map the streets, know which block is the no entry zone. We warn our homegirls, our mouths a nightly news report. We are taught pretty to bide the time, wait the teeth of consumption till it ravages our bodies. We bear witness to our erasure, unseen, the way you sometimes cannot see a shadow when it is too dark. We frontline yet last in line, our rights unraveled by crisis. Today's headlines read, girls banned from secondary education, women's progress set back by pandemic. Yet still, within us hums a freedom song, lives the laboring of our mother's persistence. Yet still, we reclaim space, say to doors closed in our face, unhinge yourself. I belong here. We self-portraits of resistance. Aren't we limitless and boundless? How yet still we overcome.
2020 was supposed to be a year to celebrate, to mark the success of all we committed to 25 years ago at the World Conference of Women in Beijing, the forum where then US First Lady Hillary Clinton so famously declared, women's rights are human rights. But not only did COVID make milestone convenings impossible, the fact of the matter is that despite decades of tireless effort, we haven't achieved nearly enough on the gender equality front to celebrate. In fact, we're witnessing great rollbacks. We're in the midst of a targeted undermining of women's sexual and reproductive rights and a quote-unquote shadow epidemic of violence against women. And unconscious bias and pernicious cultural behaviors seem to get even more entrenched, even as we struggle to expose them. We're all born of women. Every single human who has ever lived came from a mother, had grandmothers. Women have been, in so many visible and invisible ways, the bedrock of our societies. Yet true equality still eludes us, in economies, in politics, in power. We can't let that stand. So today, Day 2 of the SDG Action Zone, we're going to reflect on our progress, because there has been progress. There are more girls in school than ever before. Global maternal mortality has fallen. 131 countries are getting legal and regulatory reforms pushed through in support of gender equality. But we're going to chart a course forward too, to making gender equality the reality it should already be. We'll fight to challenge biases and change mindsets, to ensure equal rights and equal choices, to champion women as leaders on the world's biggest solutions. We'll meet heroes on the ground in Argentina, Somalia, Lebanon, as well as global leaders and titans of industry. So stay tuned, you do not want to miss a thing. Which reminds me, we want you to jump into the conversation whenever and wherever you like. So type all your questions into our virtual platform. We'll be coming back to those at the end of the day in our Ask Away session. And if a conversation resonates with you, inspires you, challenges you, post about it. Just use hashtag SDG Action Zone 2021 and hashtag For People for Planet on Twitter, Instagram, or wherever you social. Finally, before we go deep into today's sessions, we're truly honored that two women who are nothing short of remarkable were able to make time for this year's SDG Action Zone, and us, by sharing short video messages. First, we have New Zealand's youngest Prime Minister ever. From making history by bringing her newborn to the General Assembly in 2018, to guiding her country through the COVID-19 crisis with practically unprecedented success. She is a model for women and mothers and strong leaders everywhere. It's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. Then we'll hear from a special guest you probably know from stage and screen. After all, she's an Oscar winner. But she uses her star power to speak up passionately for those who don't have the platform and privilege that she does. Get ready for UN Women Global Ambassador Anne Hathaway. So enjoy, and I'll see you in a bit with our first big plenary conversation of the day.
Ina mana, ina reo, tēnā koutou katoa. I bring warm greetings in Te Reo Māori, language of the Indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm honoured to participate in this opening plenary session of the SDG Action Zone, and the theme of gender equality is close to my heart. New Zealand is a long-standing champion for the rights of women and girls in all their diversity. We were the first country where women won the right to vote, and we have been fortunate to have many outstanding women leaders guiding our nation. But we cannot rest while significant hurdles to gender equality remain both at home and abroad, and at a time when women's leadership is more crucial than ever. The world is reeling from the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, the climate crisis, natural disasters, conflict and fragility. Inequalities within and between countries have deepened. Our health systems, our economies, our livelihoods have been hard hit. These global crises have exacerbated structural inequalities that impact our most vulnerable communities, including women and girls. Hard-won gains have been lost and more than 120 million people have been pushed into extreme poverty. The rate of gender-based violence in all corners of the world has increased significantly. It has been called the shadow pandemic. Sexual and reproductive health and rights, which have long been under-prioritised and under-resourced, have suffered globally. As the world has watched the escalating crisis unfold in Afghanistan, I'm deeply worried about Afghan women and girls, their rights to education, work and freedom of movement. New Zealand urges people in positions of power and authority in Afghanistan to protect these rights and prevent any form of discrimination and abuse. These ongoing crises demand collective global action grounded in the Sustainable Development Goals to ensure no one is left behind in our response and recovery. In times of crisis, conflict and fragility, women are often the first responders. Only by fully and meaningfully including women and girls in leadership and decision-making at all levels can we ensure our responses to these events meet the needs of everyone. We must also actively consider how our national responses to crises, including our actions to stimulate economic recovery, can increase social and economic inclusion and not exacerbate existing inequalities. It is fundamental to ensure cash payments and social protection services are weighted towards vulnerable groups, including women and girls. We must also do more to support women-led businesses, including micro, small and medium-sized enterprises, to be part of economic recovery, so they can more readily experience the benefits of trade. Trade can improve women's lives, creating new jobs, enhancing consumer choice and increasing women's bargaining power in society. This year, New Zealand is hosting APEC 2021. One of our priorities is increasing inclusion and sustainability for recovery. Through this work, New Zealand will continue to focus on strengthening women's economic empowerment, as well as expanding this to highlight and progress Indigenous economic inclusion. New Zealand is a country with a vision of equality, that all people, regardless of race, gender, disability, religion, identity or other characteristic, should have the opportunity to thrive and succeed. Peaceful societies must be inclusive societies, where diversity is embraced and everyone has both the means and the opportunities to reach their potential. Where vulnerable groups, including women and girls in all their diversity, are able and encouraged to exercise their voice and agency. Gender equality is at the heart of global economic and social progress. While we have made great strides, significant challenges remain. Let us work together to redouble our efforts to achieve gender equality, to make the path easier for the women and girls who follow us, and to shape a more equal and inclusive future for generations to come. Mā te mahi tahi, ka ora ai, whakapapawaita, e tātou katoa. By working together, great things can be achieved. Thank you.
When it comes to gender equality, we're at a global crossroads with evidence that this is both the most promising and most terrifying moment in recent memory. On the one hand, the Generation Equality Forum in Paris led to more than 1,000 commitments to action and $40 billion pledged to empower women and girls across sectors and across generations. On the other, the Taliban in Afghanistan are showing us violent, extreme misogyny writ large, underlining just how quickly progress towards gender equality can be reversed. On the one hand, we are seeing examples of people rallying to get through the COVID-19 pandemic on international news and in our own homes. On the other, as we locked down and locked ourselves in to protect our family's health, across the world, women lost their jobs and income to take on childcare and homeschooling, and traditional, gendered household roles rapidly became preeminent. Even before the pandemic hit, globally, women were doing 3 times as much unpaid care work as men. Women became the shock absorbers for the crisis, with 59% reporting spending even more time on unpaid domestic work since the pandemic began. This has enduring consequences, both for their ability to re-engage in their previous lives and their ability to earn a living. This must change. The world has now begun to recognize caregiving work as essential in the crisis. Good. Now back that recognition with policies and actions to properly support and reward that work, putting care at the center of a sustainable and just economy, one that can support everyone to flourish, and then we have the prospect of solid, sustainable change. We know that public investments in social infrastructure like caregiving services could create 40 to 60% more jobs than the same investments in useful physical constructions like bridges. These kinds of public investments are integral to rebooting and achieving sustainable economic growth, as expanding quality care services creates jobs and increases support for unpaid caregivers. Those affordable quality care services are critical to support women's entry or re-entry into the labor force, as well as to foster the well-being of children and older people. The world is now facing the choice between doubling down on the mistakes of the past or seizing the opportunity to do things differently. We have a generational opportunity and an imperative to use the recovery to shape a better, more gender equal, and sustainable world, one that may finally be immune to the reversal of progress. Our actions and decisions now are what determine that future. I know that today we're going to hear from the thought leaders, business leaders, and policymakers who can help take us there. We're counting on you. Thank you.
Whatever you might have heard, achieving gender equality is not as simple as ensuring equal pay or equal representation. Not at all. It's a nuanced, complicated, and messy struggle, rife with biases, archaic laws, and deeply ingrained exclusionary behaviors that undermine lasting progress. But that's all the more reason to battle mightily for gender equality, because women represent half the human population, and there should be no argument about our value, whether it's in the home or in the most exalted halls of power. So, in this next conversation, we're going to take a look at the big picture of gender equality, where it stands, what needs to happen next, and why achieving it has never, ever mattered more. I'm so excited to introduce our guests. First, a full-time social activist and founder of the unapologetically feminist youth-led platform, She Says, someone who doesn't hesitate to speak up for women around the world. Welcome, Trisha Shetty. Next up is the head of the Development Bank of Rwanda, who's seen her country undergo profound transformations since its civil war in 1994, and is herself a testament to the fact that while gender parity isn't easy, it's not a pipe dream. Hello, Kampeta Pichet Sayanzoga. And finally, please welcome Dakshita Vikramaratni. Across Asia and the Pacific, he's bringing boys, men, and young people with him on a journey to advance gender equality and sexual and reproductive health from the ground up. Welcome all. How's it going? So forgive me, but I think this is one of those situations where it's best to start with the hardest question first. What's the biggest obstacle to achieving gender equality from your perspective? And how do we eliminate it? Trisha, why don't we start with you?
Old, white, straight men.
Period, full stop.
Yes.
And how do we mitigate that challenge or even eliminate it, overcome it?
By asking for representation, equal representation beyond tokenism, by protecting the voices on the front lines who are doing the God's work for us all during these times. That means protecting the human rights activists, the journalists, the truth seekers and the tellers, if you may. And by, I believe, unapologetically questioning our current leadership for their failures and their abdication of duty and responsibility, and demanding that they do better.
I love that answer. And Dakshita, it's a perfect transition to you because your work has focused in particular on men and bringing them into this conversation. So what do you think the biggest challenge is facing achieving gender equality, and how do we mitigate it? But also I'd love for you to build a little on what Trisha has just said about old white men being part of the problem.
Absolutely. And I think as men, we need to accept the privilege we have in society because we live in a patriarchal society. So I think in my opinion, the biggest problem is patriarchy and the fact that we are not actually challenging that. So once all of us start challenging patriarchy, I think that will be a starting point to create an equal society.
So Kampita, what is the biggest challenge in your mind to achieving gender equality, and how do we overcome it?
I think the first, how to overcome it, let me start with how we overcome it. We overcome it with courage. That's number one. I think we all know in our daily lives what are the challenges that we face. For example, when we talk about work-life balance for women, when we talk about the additional burden that women have at home versus at work, when we talk about access to finance, all of these are issues that we know in our daily lives, but we need courage to be able to change the status quo. We need courage to be able to change policies and make and actually embrace the fact that some specific actions will need to take place and not let society run its course.
These are all incredible answers, and I think they lead really naturally into the work that you're all doing. So talk a little bit about what your individual work is at the moment. And it'd be great to hear too how our participants can either support you in that work or even add to it. Kampita, kick us off on this one. And I want to flag here that Rwanda is the highest ranking in the world in terms of female parliamentarians, if I have that statistic correct. And we'd love to hear you reflect on that, why that's possible, and how, again, our participants can actually mirror that in their own governments and in their own countries.
Thank you, Nadir. I think it starts with the realization that once you include women in the daily decision-making and in the decisions that are being taken, whether it's in economics, in politics, in judiciary, in governance, everybody gains. And unfortunately, the debate has often been posed like, it's women against men, or it's promoting the right of women against, the status quo of men and a patriarchal society. And the way we've approached it in Rwanda is to say, no, actually, when you promote women, the first beneficiaries are men, because they're also suffering from quite a bit of pressure. They're also not benefiting from having a diverse view in their boardrooms. They're also not benefiting from their women, making money in their businesses. And therefore, we've changed the narrative to not make it, women for women, but more saying by promoting women, the entire society benefits, starting with men. And that's kind of a different way of looking at the gender aspect. And even the other way around, because now we have achieved gender parity in primary school, and girls actually perform better than boys. And is this something that's desirable for society? No, it's not, because we want to be sure that we have equal opportunity for all. So the way in my individual work this translates into is, as you rightly said, in Rwanda, we've made amazing strides when it comes to improving access to decision-making bodies for women. We've done great in the public sector, but the private sector is not doing as well. So if you go to the private sector, for example, on the boards of banks, you have more men than women. If you go in the top, executive committees of financial institutions, we don't have as many women as men. We don't yet have gender parity. So the area that's always lagging behind a bit and is harder to achieve is really the area where government has the least, influence, which is private sector. So my job, in a nutshell, is to make sure that we transpose some of the best practices that we've achieved in the public sector now in the private sector through access to finance.
And how do we support you in that? Because that feels like it's the real work, right? We have these conversations and these commitments, but in order for it to filter into society at large, we need to be able to make exactly the changes you're talking about in the private sector. And what can we do to sort of join you or support you in this critically important work?
So the first thing is really to design programs that are a bit capitalist in nature. You know, we all want to do what's right, but sometimes we need a little nudge, right? So one of the programs that is truly, I would say, innovative that we've launched recently is really to give an interest rate rebate for companies that are gender sensitive, for companies that have sexual harassment policies, companies that have sanitary pads in their bathrooms, companies that have a breastfeeding room, companies that do the basics. You know, you'd think sanitary pads in a bathroom is not really asking a company to break their profit, you know, their profit.
And it's not rocket science.
Yet, it's not rocket science, and yet it makes a huge difference for women who are working in factories, who are working in tea plantations, and in all these areas of economic development. So the support that we need is to start thinking about putting a bit of money behind, you know, the good things that we want to do. And what we've seen is when we want companies to do the right thing and we put our money where our mouth is, that's actually an incentive that allows them to do what they maybe would have done in 15 years, they're able to do in 2 years.
And we like that math. The sooner the better. So I have to push on this just a tiny bit more because everything that you're saying is so compelling. But I have to ask from that perspective of what's challenging, why do you think this isn't happening other places? Why is this not happening elsewhere? How do we push on that front and make it happen in lots of places that seem progressive but aren't necessarily seeing the same results you are?
I think the most important thing is to define what is the new normal. It is important that we define that having sanitary pads in the bathroom or breastfeeding room is not a special program. It's not, you know, it's not something that you're doing that is out of your responsibility as a corporate, for example. And that's the approach that we've taken in Rwanda and that has really worked for us is, you know, if I have 10 positions of leadership, having at least 4 assigned to women is not a favor that I'm doing to women. It's not for me to be on the news. It's just basic corporate responsibility, right? And I think the minute we do that, then we'll see more and more places doing that. And you'd be surprised. I mean, I have many fellow female CEOs that still haven't put sanitary pads in their bathrooms. They have their periods every month. They know that women need period pads, right? Mm-hmm. But it's just because it's not the normal thing, right? And one anecdote that I can share is I remember the first time we put period pads in our bathroom, my head of procurement was like, what if they steal them? And I was like, why don't you worry about toilet paper being stolen? Like, you know, you don't ask everybody to bring their own toilet paper roll because it could be stolen. And then all of a sudden he realized his own bias, you know, and said, okay, fine, you have a point, you know, this is ridiculous. So we all have these personal biases that have made measures towards gender empowerment and toward women as special measures, you know, with special consideration, when in the real world, these are just like basic human rights or basic corporate responsibility issues.
As you can see, I'm almost falling out of my chair because everything you're saying, it feels just intrinsically right and obvious, and it's almost staggering that it hasn't happened as yet. So, Trisha, what are you doing with respect to women's rights and women in general right now? Where's your work? Does your work stand? And how can our participants join you and support you?
Thank you. So we run an organization called She Says, where we hope to address the pervasive gender-based inequality and violation that people face in India. And truthfully, during these times, it goes back to what I said earlier about protecting the frontline defenders, right? I belong to the world's largest democracy. I belong to the largest youth population, right, as a country. And we are living times where human rights activists, defenders of human rights, of journalists are being actively punished and censored for doing the work that they're doing. And more often than not, the people who do get punished, you know, then be it social media slander campaigns online, or be it threats, trolling, or be it arrests, arbitrary arrests, or be it, you know, being killed for the work that you do, are the most marginalized and vulnerable. And unfortunately, that ends up being women, more often than not in most cultures and societies. So what can people watching this do? Every time you see a world leader coming to stage and telling you about the very many great things they are doing, question them about how they are not doing enough, question them about the state of women in their country, about the rights that women do not have access to, about the leadership that leader, what does that leadership table look like, that leader holds, occupies, enjoys? Who are the leaders within the room of said leader, right? And demand that they do better, demand that those people look like you and I, because we have seen this time and again that with we have data too that says that if you have the representation that we need that looks like citizenry, you will have then access to rights, you will have access to better economic justice, social justice, education, sanitation, all of that. So currently, specifically with regards to what can the leaders do, amplify the voices of the most marginalized women within your community that are fighting, protect them with whatever social capital equity that you do have, and continue to demand for better from leadership.
It's incredible because I think that point that you made in the middle of that wonderful, eloquent answer is so compelling that this is not an unsolvable problem. If we simply put women in these positions, then they're bringing the solutions to the table. It's not as though we have to climb Mount Everest every single time we ask this question. But Dakshita, I'd love to toss to you here, because obviously, when we are seeking a seat at the table, oftentimes the people we're seeking that seat from are men. And I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit about your work and what you all are doing to sort of shift mindsets, because it seems that that's the real issue. It's not that people don't recognize that this is a problem or what the potential solutions are, but there does seem to be a problem getting the behavior and the mindsets to shift, particularly around men and young boys, to get them in this mindset that they too are part of this fight. So could you reflect on that for us a bit?
Sure. And the work I do is in the intersection of sexual and reproductive health and rights on one hand and peace and reconciliation on the other. And my work on sexual and reproductive health and rights, I believe that they are at the center of gender equality. Without talking about sexual and reproductive health and rights, we really can't think of a world where all genders would live equally. And I'm saying that because it is connected to so many other levels of gender inequalities currently in the world, in terms of reproductive injustices, in terms of women's agency, in terms of economic empowerment, in terms of education. Just like Trisha said, it's an interconnected arena where we really need to look at solving this from a diverse, multifaceted way of bringing solutions together. And for an example, maternal mortality is obviously a solvable thing, because you need to create, if you are from the government, if you are the Ministry of Health, how can you make gender sensitive budgets so that there'll be more gender sensitive approaches in terms of establishing hospitals, providing health services through the clinics and your professional healthcare workforce, right? So one of the statistics is really compelling is that if all women right now living in the world have access to modern contraceptives, the maternal mortality rate would go down by 30%, right? So that's just one example. So it's obviously possible to look at it from a different perspective and solve the inequality issue. And I'm saying this particularly from an intersectional point of view, just like Trisha said. I think we need to bring diverse people to the table, because different communities in the world are being affected disproportionately, particularly with regard to COVID-19 pandemic. The supply chains were affected, businesses were closed. So many women were struggling to access contraceptives, which they anyway struggle to access, right? So we really need to look at it from an intersectional point of view. A person belonging to the LGBTIQ community is sort of double, because one layer is patriarchy and then this other layer of sociocultural factors which actually affects them from accessing healthcare services, information on sexuality and reproductive health. So we really need to bring these communities to the table. And we have a saying in Sri Lanka where it's very popular among the youth advocates communities that if you don't get the seat at the table, don't leave the room. Sit on the floor, sit on the table, but just make sure you be part of the conversation.
I love don't leave the room. That's good advice for all of us in pretty much every situation, but especially when we're fighting for equal rights. All of this is incredibly compelling for a lot of different reasons. But I love the focus that I'm hearing from all three of you on possibility. This doesn't seem insurmountable. So I would love to hear something that gives you hope. What is an organization that's doing particularly interesting or compelling work, or a particular study that you've seen that gives you insight into the future that makes you excited for the possibilities on the gender equality front? Campeta, why don't we start with you on this one?
So I'm a little bit of a geek, I must say it as a disclaimer, because I'm an economist. And, you know, as economists, we have institutions that are known to be very conservative, right? Like, so the most conservative institutions in any country is typically the central bank. And at the international level, it's the IMF. So when the central bank of my country started talking about access to finance for women, started releasing reports about the impact of, you know, access to finance for women, access to collateral, for me, this was wide, you know, my eyes were wide open, because typically these are things that are discussed by the Ministry of Gender, by maybe the Ministry of Finance, right? At the international level, we're used to the UN family talking about gender equality and inclusiveness. Now, when Madame Christine Lagarde brought the debate to the IMF, everybody kind of raised an eyebrow saying, you know, are you sure you're in your lane as the MD of the IMF to talk about gender equality? And when she made the case that, you know, gender equality is an economic growth requirement, then people listened with a more attentive ears, because it came from, you know, from what was an untraditional corner. And I think that gives me hope, you know, if the institutions that kind of set the tone of what economic development represents actually are able to have open and informed and quantitative discussions about gender issues, then I think we're on the right track, because very often their voice is the loudest.
The idea is it so strongly normalizes these things that to us should have been normal this entire time, but now we're getting those signals from these halls of power that this is not just part of the conversation, but a critical part of the conversation.
Yes, and in my own country, 10 years ago, we had one female banker, right? Today, we have 45% of bankers are female CEOs. That's a major jump, I think, from a leadership point of view in a traditional male-dominated society. I mean, when I started entering boardrooms, I was usually the youngest and the only woman in economics and finance. And today, when I go to boardrooms, like, the landscape has completely changed. Nobody notices that there are women in the room because it has become the norm, right? And I emphasize that because I think the key thing is it shouldn't be a headline, you know, that we have 40% of women in the boardroom. We will have won this fight when it will no longer be a headline.
You're in my brain, because I was about to say, to call it a major step is a dramatic understatement. And yet what we need is for it to be not a statement at all. We need for it to be the standard. And Dakshita, what about you? What's giving you hope right now?
So one of the initiatives we started in Sri Lanka with the youth organization was that we really looked at how we can improve the access to information on sexual and reproductive health and rights for people living with hearing disabilities. And we started doing this because we realized that there's a big communication gap and people rely on sign language in terms of accessing information. So the sign language interpreters do not have information on SRHR, or we don't have enough publications or materials for people with hearing disabilities to access that information. And we developed a new sign language glossary. We started working with the Ministry of Health. We engaged different players in Sri Lanka in terms of UN agencies, government agencies, civil society, and bring them to the table. So it was really inspirational to see young women who are living with hearing disabilities really taking the leadership in terms of moving this initiative forward, really trying to hold the government stakeholders accountable when we always had these advisory group meetings in terms of pushing for the sign language glossary, but also making sure that more people are actually engaged in terms of really disseminating this information and getting them to use it in a more efficient way. Talking about the police forces, talking about the healthcare officers, and talking about even media, for an example, because media has a very critical role to play in terms of portraying good stereotypes. We have always seen, my personal opinion, that there are so many negative stereotypes are being portrayed again and again by media, because that really helps them sell their products, right? So that is something we need to really question. So accountability is the key. And I think intersectionally, if we can bring different diverse communities together, I think that's the way to go, because we really can't we are living in 2021 and we only have 9 more years to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And if we really truly want to commit to that, Exactly. Clock is ticking right now. Tick tock, right?
Absolutely.
So we really need to bring the communities together.
I love this point about media too, because you are right. There's an agenda there often, and we need to tell the stories that we see out in the field. Trisha, I'd love to go to you, hearing about what's giving you hope, what you're seeing right now that feels encouraging and like it's a source of real possibility on gender equality.
Thank you. So sex education is in effect banned in India. We don't have sex education like in many countries, and I don't want to position this problem with a developing country, a third world country. We see these conversations happen even around America with the hesitancy of addressing sex education.
Absolutely, right at this moment we're seeing that. So
exactly.
Please.
So we at She Says have developed a gender sensitization program that looks at inclusivity, that looks at not just connecting people to their rights so that they know how to take action and have access to the rights, but also then addressing inclusion from a perspective of religious minorities, from a perspective of caste-based oppression and discrimination that people face, from a perspective of your gender identity or gender, how you identify. So we have been conducting these sessions for a long time, and we are currently in talks with the government of Maharashtra to hopefully roll this out across government schools and educational institutes, because 1 out of every 2nd child in India has attested to being sexually abused, out of which 51.4% are young boys. And most of this abuse happens in intimate settings within homes. So it's your uncle, it's your father, it's your grandfather, it's the friend. And this needs to be dismantled actively, right? And since the home structure is not really equipped to deal with this, we're hoping that if we strengthen, like we talk about within the framework of the SDG, strengthening resilient infrastructures, what does that look like? So if we strengthen educational institutes to take onus and ownership and equip them on how to handle this, we are really hoping to transform lives of so many children who don't have to live with the same reality that I have lived, that my parents have lived through, right? And the second thing, and I think I would be remiss if I don't mention this, what gives me hope is the pictures of Afghani women who have been taken to the streets demanding to be seen. Because I think it's abhorrent that the US leadership has decided to position this in a way of one section of people, their lives have more importance, and that is the US citizens, their lives have more value and importance, and Afghani citizens don't. And you see that in the rescue operations. You see that from the traumatizing pictures that you saw of people just trying to get to the airport, of just trying to get away from a clearly precarious, dangerous situation. And if you talk about women's rights, you cannot talk about it without acknowledging what the fear, the climate of fear that Afghani women are living through right now. And in the face of that dereliction of duty and responsibility from, quote unquote, the leader of the free world, you see Afghani women take to the streets, demand to be seen, demand to not be erased, and speaking up for their rights unequivocally without the patronage of leaders of the free world. And that gives me hope. Their refusal to be erased, their refusal to back down, and their demand that their rights be fulfilled and met.
That is traumatizing is exactly the right word here. But it's also, it does make me hopeful to hear you talk about what you see in these experiences. And what I'm hearing as a recurring theme is that information, insight, these are the things that push us forward and actually change these just difficult and heartbreaking situations that we see. So I wonder if you all could reflect a little bit on what you would say to the young woman or even the young man that's wanting to fight for a seat at the table for herself or for his sisters and the women around him. What is your advice to those young people who are trying to make that stand, but they're not necessarily being given a way in? How do you help them to see what's possible? And what's the practical advice to help them actually do it? Dakshita, why don't we start with you on this one?
I would say,
besides never leave the room, because I loved that as a piece of advice. Sit in.
Yeah, so never leave the room, but also start with yourself. Start questioning yourself. Start questioning, your family, because I think it's really important to start within you. Because I believe that change starts when you change yourselves. that is how I became a feminist, because I acknowledge the privileges I have been given because of my gender, and I have to let go of some of those privileges in terms of the broader discussion on equality. So just make sure that if you have sisters, if you have siblings, just make sure that there are equal opportunities given to them from your parents. Start questioning some of the traditional practices if they're harmful. Engage with your community members and asking those questions. Be brave and raise questions in the school in terms of accessing sexuality education, and be brave to learn more information. Educate yourself about feminism. Feminism is sometimes scares men away, and you shouldn't be scared to become a feminist. What you need to do is to read about it, educate yourself about it, and be proud for who you are.
Be born a feminist. Absolutely. And Kempeta, what about you? We'd love to hear your advice, and especially given your perspective as someone who's broken a pretty dramatic glass ceiling by all of our estimation.
So let me start by giving a disclaimer, because I was very fortunate to have a very supportive government. So whatever I've achieved because the working environment was conducive, right? So I don't want to look like a warrior. I was definitely fighting in a very, very conducive environment provided by my government. But there are a few lessons that I can share. I think the first one is really, if you are visible, that's a step forward. Do not be silent. And very often when you work in an environment that's either male dominated or has ageism, everybody does everything in the room to make you look invisible. And you have to fight that, and you have to be visible. And at the beginning, they'll treat you like a mad person, and eventually they'll get used to you. Then the second one is really around, if you're the youngest person in the room, use it to your advantage. Don't have imposter syndrome. You're there for a reason. And if you don't know something, ask the questions. And I see very often young people, fighting to show that they know. And yet I would say the charm that you have by being present is nobody assumes that you know. So take advantage of the fact that the assumption is not that you know, to actually learn from what's happening in the room and be very candid about the things that you don't understand. And that's the only way you're going to learn in the boardroom. And then my final advice is really around young ladies, because most of us get to become managers and to have positions of responsibility at the same time when you're getting married, and at the same time when you're having your first kid, and at the same time when you're being offered the second man. So everything tends to it feels like a perfect storm, like everything good that you've been waiting for is happening at the same time. And I think the biggest mistake that we do is that we try to be excellent at all of these things. And the best advice I ever got was from an older and very senior woman in my field, who told me, Kempeta, you'll never be good at everything. So choose what your battle is for that day and leave the others alone. Otherwise, you're just going to blow. And I think this suppressing the need to be a champion in everything is actually the safest way to get to where you want to go.
Well, there's a moment in every SDG Action Zone where I start to tear up, and this was it. So thank you for just giving voice to something I think so many women and even men can relate to. And Trisha, why don't you take the last word on this? What's your advice for young women fighting for a seat at the table right now?
When I first started the work, right, I really wanted the seat at the table. And after doing the on-ground work, working with communities, and when I finally got in the doors, the gold-gilded doors, I looked around and realized they really don't know what they're talking about. They have no idea what's happening on ground. Like crickets, they're clueless. So the one piece of advice I will give anyone is, do not feel the need to be deferential. Do not have your imposter syndrome where you question, am I legitimate? Am I worthy? Because if you have gotten there, it's because of your own ground work, your work with communities, right? That has gotten you there, and that provides you all the legitimacy you need to question the people who have occupied those seats and refused to let it go, where literally their butt prints are printed on those seats. You have all the legitimacy to question them. The second thing I would say is, once you get seat at the table, you tend to get scared that the system is rigged against us. They then make you dilute your fight. They then make you dilute your voice, make you feel like you have to filter yourself, you have to censor words that you say. So one thing that I tell myself is, I'm perfectly fine not being reinvited to a place. I have no attachment to that stage, to the people, because that then reminds me of who my people are, who am I answerable to, the communities that brought me there. So then I truly force myself to speak truth to power, once I too am within the power structures and echelons, right? Because it's easier when you're on the outside questioning them, but once you're on the inside, that's when it really starts getting to you and you start questioning, should I be softer? Because then you've tasted from the glass and silver plates. So be sure to not be attached to the spaces that you are in, not be deferential, and finally continue working with your communities. Regardless of having a seat at the table, remember what your North Star is, your Blue Star is, and that's working on ground with your communities. Because when you have your feet to the ground, you then have a sense of purpose to have a seat at the table, and you know exactly what to ask and demand for. You know where your conviction comes from. You know what to speak, because trust me when I tell you, they don't know. And without your voice there, telling you what the community needs, the money will not go to the right places, and the mic, even though it's there, will not serve a purpose of amplifying voices.
And we will never change all the things that we're talking about that are wrong right now. What an incredible panel. So much of it resonates with me, but I have to say, this idea that we all fight so hard to be in this conversation is so real, because once you're in the conversation, it's so natural to say, I never want to be out of it again. And my responsibility is to be allowed to stay here. And that's the wrong way to go about it, because the fact that we are here means that we get to be honest and give voice to a lot of what we're hearing in our own communities, which is incredible. These folks that are here today just embody this idea of responsibility, because as a human and as an American and as somebody who is watching what's happening all around the world, I often worry that we have lost our sense of responsibility to others. But the folks on this panel and the folks in the entire 2021 SDG Action Zone just, I think, give us all hope that that responsibility is real and we are acting on it every single day. Kampita, Trisha, and Dakshita, this has been an incredible conversation, and there's so much more to come. So stay with us.